Let's get this party started. My name's Brandon Cook. I own Cook Brothers Landscaping. I'm a board-certified master arborist, a certified professional horticulturist. I'm a plant nerd at heart. I've owned a landscape company 6 years. I've been in the industry 13 professionally, and I'm also your president for Snohomish County WALP. If you have any problems with this presentation or any problems in general, write them in a letter, mail them to somebody else. But if you want help, you can call me and I'll help you out.
Name's Zach Zobrist. I know some of you guys have met me before. I graduated from WSU with a degree in landscape nursery and greenhouse management and a minor in horticulture. I've been in the industry for about 5 years now, gone from being a grower to being a salesperson to being a grower again, and now nursery manager for Due to Sound Plants, Snohomish.
And he's the last of his kind. They're a dying breed, those horticulturists actually coming out of four-year school. So I'm really appreciative to have Zach's botany.
20,000 people graduated in my class. One graduated with my degree.
That's him. And so today we're going to do about a 30-minute presentation. We're going to try and keep it short at 30 minutes. Start heckling us to speed up or whatever you think will get us to be quiet. Because we're going to go over planting, transplanting, and how to make money doing it. Because that is the #1 concern I hear from landscape business owners and other people, justifications clients are making for previous installers about why their plants look so terrible now. And when I'm routinely pointing out that they look terrible, that's usually the answer that comes back to, this is the way we've always done it. Terrible excuse. And I got to make money somehow. Again, a terrible excuse because there's other ways to do it.
So the strategy is going to be having Brandon talk about his experiences, what he wants to do, and then I'm going to jump in and talk about it from a botany perspective to give you guys some idea of what's actually happening with the plants. Hopefully help inform some of your own choices.
Absolutely. So we're just going to get right into it. So for any of you guys who have crews or you're doing it yourself, you got to remember your PPE. This is something my crews are drilling every Monday morning, but if you're planting, you've got to get those glasses on. They're clear. They really don't impact you too much. And I'm going to grab my gloves as well and a couple of my favorite planting tools. I love a hori-hori. It's a knife that gets in there. It's got serrations on one edge, a little bit of a planting blade on the other. And then if I'm planting, I'm probably pruning some roots. Why do I got to be pruning roots? Because not all nurseries are as great. Oh yeah, I love this glasses master. Favorite part. Not all nurseries are as great as Puget Sound plants, and that's not to say they're perfect here, but I do certainly have less plants that I have to correct from here than from some other places I may be sourcing. So I'm going to start with some herbaceous perennials, and then we might move into some larger plants. Get my gloves on because that's also a safety thing. There's tons of fungus, bacteria, and all these kinds of things in the ground, and if you're tussling with plants, you're liable to get a scratch. How many of you want to be paying L&I for somebody to be sitting around as they're recovering from an infected scratch? I certainly don't.
I can tell you that you don't want to, and also tell you that he's absolutely correct. The worst wound is the wound that somebody has while they're handling the soil of a plant, because you're just going to dig everything into it.
Yeah, hepatitis is in the soil, guys. Come on now, don't get hepatitis from planting.
Not my soil.
I hope not. So that's one of the first things we're going to look at when we're grabbing a plant is when you're out in the nursery, it's really convenient to call in an order, which is fantastic, and someone's selecting the plants for you. But one of the things I like to do is even if I'm calling an order, I'm going to take a look at a couple of those plants to see what my root system looks like, because every plant I touch, I'm going to inspect that root system. And so if they are looking better than worse, it's going to take my crews less time in the field. That's also going to inform my decisions on who I'm buying from in the future. So when I'm grabbing a plant originally.
So let me talk a little bit about roots, if you don't mind.
For it.
So when you're taking a look at roots, and I'm glad we got a nice one here. Or I'd like to taking a look at roots, you've got a couple different things that you want to be looking for. You're looking for the root mass to be cohesive. You also don't want to see a lot of brown. Now, obviously, there's some plants where that's an exception, but most of the time, you're not going to have a lot of color in the roots. They should be a bright white and actively growing. The whiter they are, the more actively they're growing, the healthier the plant is. You also don't want to see it so compact that you can't shake the roots off.
Just talking about plant.
Sorry, what? Anyways, you don't want it to be so overgrown that you can't get the soil off. If I were to hit this with my fist, which I'm not going to do, all the soil would go flying off. And that's actually a good thing. If it's been in the pot for 2 or 3 years, this will be half the size and it'll be a solid, wet mass of gross. Bad news.
Absolutely. So when I'm going to grab a plant, one of the most important things I'm going to look at is my soils on site and my planting hole. So a portion of that depends on the site you're at. Most of us oftentimes get to view that site before we begin our planting. Hopefully that's informing some of your plant choices, because the most important thing for plants, there's a ton of myths about this, and it has been proven, meaning hundreds and thousands of data points and tons of studies showing this is how plants survive. This is how plants are successful. So if you're going to have a question at the end about this, just remember I said that. I might repeat it again to you, is that roots need to get into that soil. I'm aware all the development around here, it's not really soil, it's just crap. But when you're amending a planting hole, you're really just building a large pot in the ground. That may be a business choice you're making. It's not one I make. If I'm going to be amending a bed, I'm going to be amending the whole stinking thing, because those roots, when they are reaching those differences in soils, are not going to want to move through that. Neither will water. That's kind of important, guys. We want to be building big root systems for our plants. We also want our water to be easily moving between our soils. So it has been in the past where people will dig big holes, deep holes, plant things deep, amend them with compost, throw in some fertilizer. Well, I heard phosphorus grows roots. Throw a little bit of that in there. If you're amending a soil, you better have done a soil test, because why are you poisoning the soil by adding fertilizers the soil may not need whatsoever? And two, if you're amending a hole, you're creating a giant pot, and that is not actually winning for you. Most of the time, my crews are not amending planting beds whatsoever, other than our mulch and compost on the top. We can talk about that at the end. Zach, you want to talk about why roots are stopping when they're reaching those edges of the hole?
I do. So big thing about plants, and I'm going to harp on this a couple of different times, is plants don't think. That obviously seems pretty obvious, right? They don't have neurological systems. So the thing is, they're much more like machines than they are like many other living things. So when roots hit a surface, a gradient in water, a gradient in texture, whatever it might be, they are going to stop growing in that direction, especially if the soil doesn't hold water as well, which I'm going to let you know, almost nothing's going to hold water as well as pure bark that we use, that most nurseries use for growing their plant material. So if it's not holding water as well, or it doesn't have nutrients, which again, fertilizer, we can use liquid feed. We don't, but many nurseries do. And that liquid feed is again going to give it an ideal environment. When it moves out of that ideal environment, if it hasn't been forced to do so, those roots are actually going to curl around and continue to grow in the more ideal conditions, which isn't what you want.
Wow, it sounds like I'm hearing some circling, girdling roots, which as an arborist, I will tell you, kills many a tree I see. We also heard one of those clues in there for what we want to do with the plants, which is it's all organic here. It's all wood. It's all bark. We've got no soil around our roots. Maybe the soil's not sacred on our plants. How many of you are protecting root balls? I hear that way too much. You cannot disturb the root ball. The root ball was broken. The root ball's falling apart. Good. Because current science is showing us start to root wash your plants. Why? It's doing a couple of things for you. It is going to speed up your installation process. You're going to get a healthier plant when it's installed. Why? It's getting a little bit of water before it gets in the ground. That way you know your plant is wet. I can tell you, I do several different nurseries, and some of them, even depending on the day, I will get a flat of plants bone dry. Those suckers actually need to soak a little bit to get some water around those roots. Some nurseries like this one, nice and wet, nice and pliable. Uh-oh, Zach's coming over here to give us another botany tip.
So that what Brandon's talking about, when you have soils dry down, especially nursery soils here in the Pacific Northwest, like they are made of bark. Bark is inherently hydrophobic when it's dry. So when you have a plant that's dry, you can't just have your guys run some water over it. It legitimately takes many different waterings over an extended period of time to truly soak that soil. So soaking it down by literally putting it in water can help alleviate some of that.
Absolutely. So one of the favorite things and techniques I use when we're setting up for planting new plants into the ground from our nurseries, as I like these little tub trugs. It's just a little rubberized tub. This one's about 20 gallons or so. I don't fill it up to the top because I don't particularly like taking a bath every time I'm working. Got some bigger ones for bigger trees, smaller ones for smaller things, shallow ones for doing entire flats at a time. And there's one of the tips and techniques my crew uses. We will put entire flats in there to start pre-soaking so we can tease those roots apart a little faster. When we're doing individual plants like this or small plantings, very specific plants, some of those treasured plants that we upsold to our client because it's so stinking special, because it's got a really fancy cultivar name, then I might be giving it a little bit more care. So the first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna get that in the water. And so one of the things is a lot of the science is showing that that soil, again, the soil on a new plant is not sacred. The roots are. We know the roots can handle a little bit of damage, but overall we want to minimize that. So if I'm going to want to speed up, if I've not given myself enough time to prep, this one's fantastic. Already, look at how much of that soil is away from this thing. I've lost just about 35–50% of all that bark, but I've got these nice fibrous roots, which actually makes it so I can make a smaller hole in the ground while making sure I'm getting my roots splayed out into that native soil. So I'm going to get quick take from this guy, be able to put some plants around it. Another big bummer I see with a lot of...
Let me jump in real quick.
Oh yeah, you go.
So another thing is, especially in smaller perennials and stuff like this, they don't like to grow down. I know this because getting them to finish in a 1 gallon can be a nightmare because they don't want to do that last 2 inches of the pot. So again, you're spreading that root system out and you're not burying it down in the ground where it doesn't want to be.
One of the top things I see killing plants is being buried too deep. How easy is it to bury a plant too deep? Oftentimes we just tell guys, yeah, dig a hole big enough for the pot. That's a terrible direction to give them. It's not very specific and it's open to a lot of interpretation. We know different sites, different spots. We're going to see rocks in the soil, tree roots in the soil, all different kinds of things. What we want for roots is a large planting area for those roots to expand in. And we know from science that most things are spreading their roots out radially. They're not sinking roots quite deeply, which is a big misconception I see a lot with people about big trees especially, but all plants are the same. It's like a wine glass where we've got our canopy up top, our trunk in the middle, and our roots splay out wide on the bottom because they need oxygen. There's not a whole lot of oxygen the further down you go into the soils. So planting deep will kill your plants. You're right. It might take 2 to 3 years. You might be happy that you passed that 1 year mark for your warranty. I'm not, because I show up and I see all these places installed by other people and I'm having to tell people, yeah, that plant's dead because it's too deep. This plant over here, pull that sucker out. Yeah, 8 to 10 inches too deep. Depending on the nursery, depending on the quality of stock, you may be receiving a plant that is already buried too deep. And that is one of the first things we're going to look at when we're dealing with woody perennials and trees. We're certainly going to follow down along that trunk to find that root flare, because we will see some adventitious roots will pop up above that root flare. Keep going. Those guys can dry up and die. It's okay. We want to make sure they are planted at the soil level or above it, especially if you're mulching. Do not be burying that with mulch or bark, because that is one of the primary vectors for funguses and diseases. It's one of the weakest portions in the trees where they move from their trunk into their roots. Same thing goes for all of our perennials and woody plants. You want to be protecting that. So if you have to do anything, plant it high, the roots will grow down. Way harder for trees and shrubs to get their roots to grow up. So
yeah, let me talk a little bit about the nursery perspective on that. So not everybody's familiar with how nurseries, I'm talking off camera, not everybody's familiar with how nurseries do their production, but generally we go through multiple potting up stages. So for something like a 5-gallon pot, I think that's actually a 2, but for a 5-gallon pot, we actually go from like a 72 cell to a 1 gallon, then to a 5. And in each one of those stages, both when we're sticking the cutting, and then from the cutting to the gallon and the gallon to the 5, at any point in that process, somebody could bury it a little too deep. And by the time you have a finished plant in a 5-gallon, it might be sitting 2 inches or 3 inches lower than you want it to, which means if you go out in the landscape and you do it again and it's sitting 4 or 5 inches down, you have that whole section of the trunk which can just rot off and kill the top of the plant while the roots look fine.
And I gotta tell you, landscapers have a bad rap when it comes to the green industry. I go to the tree care conference every year. Boy, oh boy, you don't want to hear what they say about landscapers. Landscapers must not care. They're taking their money and running. I can't tell you, Brandon, how many times I go to see a nice ornamental tree, 10, 15, 20 years old. The root cause for why it's dead, buried too deep. And I got to agree with them. We're seeing it from way too many people. And oftentimes it's because we don't know better. But when we know better, we do better. So now that you all know, I'm going to write down your names. I'll write you a letter every Christmas saying, Brandon Cook, the tree Santa, has been watching. Have you been naughty or nice? Hopefully that means you're planting things a little bit higher than everybody else, because you're going to see better retention rates on your plants than if you're burying them too deep. And like I said, trees, plants, they store a lot of this energy in their wood. So a death for a tree 1 year later, yeah, probably our fault. 2 years later, probably still our fault. 3 years, it can take a long time. I play a game with my wife. I'm sure she's really bored of it by now, where I'm like, oh, that one's dead. It'll take 3 to 5 years, but 3 to 5 years go by and I see giant, enormous stands of dead trees where I've called it, because you can see them being planted deep. People are still leaving the burlap on them. I don't care. You cannot just pull that burlap down half the way. Half the roots is still not as good as all of the roots. They're leaving the metal cages on. You're right, a couple of those roots are going to sneak out, but why would you be leaving the metal cage on if you're getting some of that glazed clay away so that our roots can actually get into our native soils? There's some of these things that start to stack on top of each other. So as we can see with this more woody perennial back here, this Catinus, if it was dry, it's really challenging to tease apart our roots, but as we start to get them wet, they're way more pliable, so I'm not doing damage when I start to spread this guy out. And this is something where I'd be using my hori and getting a little bit more aggressive to open this up and splay this out so that I'm getting my roots running in my native soils. When they're wet, they're way more pliable than when they're dry. Another reason I love soaking them. Also gives me a little bit of time when I'm planting, especially as we're doing that in June, July. I'm not planting in August, basically for any reason, or even early September, because there's not enough water in our ground and it's all hydrophobic. But in June and July, I'm still going to be doing some planting. I'm going to take some extra care to make sure I've got water in that ground around my plant, properly have my roots spread, and do my absolute best to talk to the client about how to properly water a plant. Zach, you got anything to add to that?
No, not specifically. Back on the topic of the soil and planting high, another thing to remember is that the soil, again, like I said, is bark. And that bark is going to degrade in a way that your soil, your topsoil that you guys are planting in, or as Brad had put it, crap, that you guys are planting in, isn't going to degrade like that. It's going to have a lot of non-organic matter. And again, that's going to cause that soil to compress. Like I said, it happens just in the ground, same as it would in a pot. It's just going to sink down and cause even more of that depression that'll stem.
So oftentimes when my crews are rolling up to a job site with plants coming in from the nursery, if we've picked them up, we're gonna make sure we had a shade cloth on them. Because like me and Zach were talking about before, he's got a concept of stacking stressors for plants, which was a great way for me to highlight some of those problems. For me, I was always worried about the wind whipping that, because it's removing the protective envelope that we have around trees. It's already starting to dehydrate as I'm taking them into the site. So our crew is going to get our shipment in. It's going to be covered and protected, so we're not losing all of that damage, creating it early. We're going to set up a couple of our soaking tubs so that really dry things go in right away, so they're easy to tease apart. And then some of the bigger things, we'll get that water closer to the site. That way we can tease apart some of the roots on our bigger plants. And I'm talking all the way up to 5-foot plants. I don't care about the size. From the smallest to the largest, bare rooting is the best planting practice as shown by science. And if you don't believe it, there's a ton of people who can show you all the anecdotes in the world. One of the biggest trees that has been transplanted only took like 3 or 4 guys in Washington State, used an air spade, got all that soil away. It's a 23-inch beech. He did it right in September, early September, which on the east side's a challenge with lack of water. No problem. 3 weeks later, pulls his stakes away. That tree's just fine. The soil's not sacred. The roots are. So we want to protect our roots, do the best things for them and that future survival of the tree.
And so I'll elaborate a little bit on what Brandon mentioned with stressors. So plants are like any other living organism. They can only handle so much abuse, so much stress before they start having problems. So when I'm looking at reasons why we might have had a crop issue, I'm looking at where were the stressors. So anytime you do anything to a plant, I'm going to let you know nothing here, no plant on our planet has evolved to be grown in a black pot and then transplanted in the ground. That is a huge stressor. Some things can't take it at all. So stressors can be, lack of irrigation, too much irrigation, temperature, root damage, stem damage, leaf damage, disease, insect damage. All of those stressors can stack on each other, and the effect is exponential. Usually plants can take 1 or 2 stressors without any problems at all. you start getting 3 or 4 or 5, and all of a sudden you start having significant losses. See it all the time in the nursery. It's why we have to be really careful with it. Somebody's raising their hand. Yeah, Deborah?
Or she's clapping. That might be
clapping.
the clapping sound.
Right.
I'm just agreeing with everything you're saying so much, so I decided to give you a clap.
So where that comes into transplanting is you are going to be doing something that is really detrimental to the plant to begin with, and you don't know what happened in the nursery, right? We get stuff from vendors all the time that I go, oh my God, this plant, all of its roots are already dead, and the top looks great. So you don't know what you're getting when you buy a plant realistically. Hopefully you're getting it from a good supplier. But you don't know what you're getting. So the best thing you can do is to reduce the stressors, right? Whatever you have control over, you want to have control over so that you can account for the 1 or 2 stressors you might not be able to control.
Absolutely. So like I was mentioning, as we're getting to some of these larger plants, we're going to let them soak so that it's pliable. I can start to tease those roots apart, usually just with my hands. Occasionally I'll be using something like a hori-hori to start getting in there, wedging things apart, opening things up. I've got some other planting tools I like to use. Well, what if we come across an issue? What do issues look like in a plant? Where is the crown of that plant? That's always a good issue to find. We're going to find that where we have root flare. And root flare, it's just like it sounds, right? As our trunk is meeting our soil, as we get down to that area, we want to see it start to swell out. And so this one has just a little bit of buried, as we know. Puget Sound plants got some gorgeous stuff. We did not walk the whole nursery just to find 1 or 2 good ones. This is routinely why they are on my suppliers list. So I've got just buried about 1 inch here, a little hard to see. But we've got this root flare here where it's starting to swell out. Oftentimes I'll find in some other nursery stuff that I use that might be 3 or 4 inches down, and you'll be like, whoa, here we are, 1 inch down into that. I'm already starting to see these little feeder roots, adventitious roots out on the side. Michelle, can you mute?
There we go.
Sweet. You'll find on some of these that are buried deep, you'll see what you think might be that root flare because you're starting to see roots. Keep looking. You've really got to find that flare. One of my favorite ways to do that is to take a hori-hori, a very vertical tool. Don't be too aggressive. Don't be scraping away that bark, but start bringing that down along the trunk, and you'll feel where that starts to kick out, and that's as deep as you need to go. I don't care how many adventitious roots are around it. Those are not going to be successful long-term for that tree or shrub. That's a really challenging thing for a plant to live through, growing its roots up. So go ahead, tease those away. Nip those off with your pruners. Another thing to look for, kinked roots, circling roots, girdling roots. They're going to continue their pathway, and it's okay. It's okay to prune a little bit of them to start to open that up, because we don't want to see a failure in 5 to 6 or 7 years, or as sometimes I'm consulting, find a death 10, 15 years later where it's obvious it was a root problem that could have been corrected at planting or anywhere along the line to save that tree.
So I was taught about this at WSU in an arboriculturalist class. They actually had a really excellent example of a tree that died on their property on WSU's main campus. It was actually it was an Acer palmatum. It was about 2.5 inch caliper. It blew over in a windstorm. So she went out there, our professor went out there and took a picture of it. It was 1 inch caliper. There was just a 1 inch piece of trunk. And then there was a root girdled all the way around it, and then there was the flare underneath it, which was 2.5 inches wide, and it just snapped over in a windstorm. Because just because it all looks like wood doesn't mean that that's the right thing for the tree. The trunk obviously is completely separate, so that girdling can kill. I mean, once you're talking about a 2.5 or 3 inch tree, that's a lot of money that just snapped over in the wind.
Absolutely, and that's where I find opportunities as that business owner and talking with clients to educate them on some of these things. You know, a lot of your clients can identify with that black thumb idea that, oh, I can't get anything to grow. Who's to say that the plant you plant, I want to be able to keep alive? That's a real concern for a lot of the clients I meet. And I'm promising you, they're definitely willing to pay more money for that guarantee. A warranty on plants, which I absolutely can give, oftentimes even without irrigation, because I know how these things are planted and I know when I'm planting. And so I oftentimes am seeing survival rates greater than 95%. If I have a failure rate of 5% or greater, I'm really digging in to see, hey, what went wrong on this job? Because our survival rate has been so high for so long across thousands and tens of thousands of plants, because we got some really great quality stuff in this area. We have a fantastic area to be growing, but there are some institutional, some things that we need to correct with our plants before they're getting into that landscape. Big part of that is get your roots into that native soil or that parent material that is in the ground. Make sure you're correcting any root problems that you come across. It's fairly easy to show your guys how this is done. Use one of those techniques is to root wash. And you're not seeing me on every plant. I am not getting all the way down to the roots on every single plant. That absolutely is a primo condition. If I'm installing a signature tree, I am going to be doing that. I'm going to get root wash into that guy, and it might take me a little bit more time. Clients are willing to do that when they're spending a hefty amount on a signature tree. On some of my smaller stuff, I'm going to get it soaking. I'm going to try and tease it apart with my fingers if I can. Then I'm going to probably bring in a tool to try to open some other things up, make sure I've found my root flare so I can make sure I'm planting at my right height, which I'm usually going to plant 2 inches high because I plan on bringing in some mulch or compost or bark chips to help that soil out. Then I'm going to prune anything that I find is a problem. That's a great time to do it. It's a great time to prune the roots when you find a problem. But hey, don't you be pruning the top of that plant while you're doing injury to the lower side.
What's that?
Don't you be pruning the top of that plant when we're already doing injury to the lower side. Does that
That's
sound like
stacking stressors.
we're stacking stressors again? Plus, plants are hormonal beasties. If you're pruning the top, that is producing some of those exact hormones the plant needs to be telling the roots to, hey, kick it in gear, guys. I need a little bit more water. I need a little bit more nutrients. When we start to do both of those things, we're stacking stressors. We are working against the plant, and we know this from lots of studies done at our glorious WSU over here. And for any of you who might have been, UW has got an okay horticultural section. That's a wink. You just can't see it behind the safety glasses.
So I'm gonna jump in real quick.
Jump, baby.
First of all, WSU is better than UW. Second of all, it's not even a competition. Second of all, we're talking about hormones in terms of plants. What specifically Brandon's talking about is auxins, the things that promote root growth, are actually produced in the tops of the plants. That way the plants are balancing. And then, is it gibberellic acid?
Yep.
Promotes shoot growth. And so those two things cancel each other out, right? The hormones have an antagonistic effect on each other. So if you want more root growth and you've got some damaged roots, you want to leave the tops alone. That way they're having more auxin production. If you chop the tops off, all it's going to do is stunt the whole process.
Absolutely. So as we're winding up this talk, you've heard a couple of things. You've thought to yourself like, hey, I already know how to plant. I've been doing it a long time. I've always done it this way. Terrible. I do not want to hear that in any of the follow-up questions that you have always done it this way. That's not a good enough reason. We want to be looking at our best management practices in our industry because our tax dollars pay for it, don't they, Will? And there's a ton of really passionate people, plant nerds, who have been testing these things and trying different things and trying it here. And then someone in that school over there is going to replicate that same thing and try it over again. There is a ton of money, a ton of experience, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of data points going into these things. And if you incorporate new practices like this, I promise you there are ways you can leverage this to get bigger profit margins while still maintaining your production rate. My crew cannot compete with the guys who are using an auger, glazing the sides of their holes, drilling them too deep, but they've got an auger, so they're fast. They can pull that sucker out, kick it into the soil, and they're out of there. You're right. My crew's not going to plant quite that fast, but you know what my crew is going to win on? Survival rate. And when I'm warranting my plants, which is a benefit to my customer, is profitable for me, I've got a low failure rate, I'm winning that way because my crews are easily able to keep up with other ones who aren't using some of these techniques. So there's a way to set up, systemize how you're going to be planting each day and with the tools you're going to use. Teach your team members how to do this. You're going to see better results. You're going to have happier clients years later. That's a key. Repeat business is a winner, am I right? I certainly love when a client calls me up 3 years later, says, this area looks gorgeous. We had a really great experience with you. We'd like you to do this other area. You won't ever get that call if 3 or 4 of those big trees died, or if 30% of those things died 2 to 3 years later. You're never going to hit that call. That's the sale you missed that you never knew you missed. So You're going to get better plants. You're going to be able to make more money. You're going to be doing things that are better for the planet. I'm not seeing the downside here. So as we're drawn to a close, I want to thank Puget Sound Plants for sponsoring us here today, having fantastic product that I can routinely rely on to be a step above a lot of our other purveyors around here. No, I didn't. I'm very selective. And now I'm going to open it up for questions. All I ask is that you be a bit respectful because it can get a bit messy on Zoom when we all want to talk at the same time. But all right, let's have at it. Let's hear a question.
Okay, I've got, how much of the circling roots can you cut off if everything is going in a circle? Is it just a lost cause?
No, that's a great question. Worst case scenarios, we've all had them. We pull out a plant, that sucker is completely root girdled. All of our roots are right on the outside. The interior is completely rotten. Hopefully that's a plant we're rejecting at the nursery. The nurseries oftentimes want to hear these things so they can improve. But that's still a time where I'm going to soak that, really open it up. And oftentimes a circling or kinking root, sometimes you don't have to cut them. Sometimes you can pull them out and straighten them out.
Right.
Like that, you win. But sometimes if we've got a real knot, you can get aggressive with it. It is going to depend on time of year. But there are definitely examples. I've done it myself with some fairly large trees where I'm pruning away over 50% of that root mass because it's more important to me today to have a proper root structure than how many roots I save. It might mean I have to water that, really baby it. And so that's certainly something to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. But hopefully if you've got a large tree, shrub, something valuable where you're like, man, these roots are not salvageable, it might be a pain in your butt. Bring that back to the nursery because that is where, as landscapers, we should be asserting some accountability to our nursery practitioners. But yeah, I've definitely pruned at least 50% of a root mass away. I did have to baby it, especially that first summer, but it's routinely done by people who are doing a lot of root washing.
Yeah, generally you want to try to avoid the approximate rule of thumb is 30-ish%, but you can get away with more if you provide the right circumstances, right time of year.
Fewer other stresses.
Yeah, and you reduce the other stressors, which if it's got a rotten core of its roots, that's not great either. But, you know, worst case is worst case, right? It happens.
I've got a bunch of other questions if nobody else has any.
Anybody else have questions?
First of all, I had not heard about not pruning the top when you are dealing with doing all this root cleaning and preparing. So thank you. That was really good because I've done exactly the wrong thing.
Oh, and it's super tempting, especially in a nursery, to just be like, oh, we only have to touch it once. Clip, plunk, done.
Well, because I thought it meant it didn't have to support so much top growth.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's one of those myths that's passed around quite a bit. Even today, there's a lot of these landscaping myths that are passed around. But Linda Chalker-Scott, great resource out of WSU, has specifically studied that and is showing, hey, you're stacking stressors. You're fighting against that plant and wanting and needing those hormones to kick some of that root growth in gear. So if I've got a plant where, hey, occasionally we'll have a broken branch after transport, I'm going to prune away a broken branch. Sure. But you're not going to see me do a heavy structural pruning on the top and a heavy root structural pruning on the bottom. I'm going to use that as an opportunity. Usually I'm trying to sell some additional maintenance to my clients. So I'm going to hopefully follow up with that in my next winter period when the plant is dormant or the top is dormant and my roots are continuing to regenerate. Then I might get in there and get a little bit more of my pruning done.
Okay. Another question is, so how long, I know what it was. In the fall, you know, a lot of things have been sitting in the nursery since the spring. And so they can be pretty sorry looking in the roots in the fall if you have to plant in the fall, which is often when, you know, you're planting. So, and I just have to soak forever. I just have to soak forever. And I don't think you're saying you can't, you don't have time to do that.
Sometimes you don't have time, and so I can get pretty aggressive when I'm tussling with the root system. But I don't know for you, Zach, but oftentimes I'm finding better quality stock in the fall for a lot of our balled and burlap and large stuff, because that's when a lot of our big suppliers are pulling is in the fall, because we know we're going to have dormant tops. Our roots are still going to be growing. So I love planting in the fall and winter because Our roots don't stop growing unless the soil's 32 degrees. Another common myth in our area. Helps keep my crews busy across the winter planting. But oftentimes, some of the larger stuff, I'm getting much better selections in the fall because I'm beating that homeowner rush in the spring where, oh, it's spring, everything's growing, let's plant. Well, in Washington State, the water's about to get turned off. I'd much rather know that I don't have to count on a homeowner watering for 4 months straight. I can count on Mother Nature's usually going to do that in a Washington winter.
I guess it's more evergreen shrubs then that are going to be a little bit more challenging. Okay, what other tools do you use for opening up your root balls?
Oh, absolutely. One of my favorites is, it's called a homie or an easy. Yeah, you're showing that little 3-pronged. I've got one of those. It's like an elephant rake or whatever they call it. The names seem to change so much, but I've got one that's a small plow blade that is a handheld. That's one of my favorite tools personally to use. But I also love one of those 3-pronged steel because then I can get in there, I can twist, I can start to leverage, open things up without causing too much direct damage. Because with the hori-hori, if I'm getting that in there, I'm going to be cutting with almost every move. I like to not be doing that every time. So yeah, either one of those 3-pronged other little tools where you can get in, pry things apart, open it up without doing damage every time. Because one of the things we didn't mention is the roots of plants do not compartmentalize as well as their stems and trunk. Remember, trees, shrubs, plants are compartmentalizers. They don't heal. Healing is replacing cell for cell. Plants don't do that. They compartmentalize. And so we got to start to think in those ways. How do I minimize damage? Because this is taking energy to do these things. I want that energy focused on new roots, new growth, a beautiful landscape.
That compartmentalization that he's talking about, again, feeds back to the idea that plants are much more like biological robots than animals are. They are going to say, this part is infected or damaged or no longer producing, and they literally like grow to seal that area off. And
they put them on an iceberg and send them out into the sea.
Yeah, basically.
You don't get it. That's what you do with old people supposedly in Alaska. So, bye. Well, this has been great for me. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Hey, Dave, Will, Rob, you guys totally agree with me? You think I'm doing amazing things? Trevor, what are you doing for planting? You guys are just like, wow, this Brandon kid, he's just got it all down. How am my business ever going to compete with them? Or do you think we found the magic sauce that I've been offering up here? Now you're like, whoa, if I had this whole time, whoo, I'd be taking over Brightwater. Well, come on, boys, let's hear it.
You just said everything I was going to say about you. That's why you did the proposal for my buddy.
You're the certified arborist, brother. I love everything you're saying. I do have a question about soil preparation for mass plantings.
Yeah.
I mean, we typically just add 2 inches of compost and till up the whole planting bed, and plant that way. You guys are talking a lot about not digging deep and not amending the soil at all and only mulching.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little more to that?
Absolutely. So one of the big things I believe, and this is starting to get into soil science, where our soil structure is a valuable thing, because soil structure is opening up capillaries in the soil for both oxygen, water, and nutrients to flow. When we till, we've eliminated all of that. Soil is a resilient thing. So it's 2 things here, and there's certainly divided opinions on this in our industry from scientists to practitioners. But one of the things I agree with, I'm more of the no-till approach, because that soil structure is really important to me. And so I can either till it all up, I'm going to destroy my soil structure, but soils are resilient. They're going to rebuild, they're going to recolonize, they're going to reform a structure. It's going to take some time. But 2, one of the things I love to do, and I can often beat other bids where someone's having to till an entire yard up, I'm going to mulch on top, because I know when I put in a nice compost or mulch on top, it's going to till itself, baby. The worms, the bacteria, the fungus, the roots, they're going to start moving those down into the soil profile. They're going to do my tilling for me. I don't have to pay worms, which is one of my favorite things about them. And so that's one way that I don't like tilling. I try to avoid it if I really can. Occasionally, you're right, there are some absolute garbage soils being basically fill soils that are being dug down from way low, parent material, being brought up and compacted on the top. there are some times where you have to fix soils or really temper your client's expectations for what's going on. I had one in Woodinville. It was a very clay-based soil, but for them, I convinced them, hey, I can either till your 2-acre yard, which is going to blow your entire budget, and we'll just focus on tilling, or we'll plant. I'll get my roots in the natives into these soils because the roots will still grow. But then you got to commit to me that you're going to mulch year after year, because I'm going to go with the compost heavy mulch because we know that's more broken down. It's going to be integrated faster. And if you do that several years in a row, you're going to improve that soil pretty rapidly. And if I really can, I'm going to bust out my secret sauce, arborist chips. Arborist chips are as close to a miracle as we get as landscapers for some weed suppression, soil building, water retention, and temperature control of our soils on either side. So I'm going to try and bust out my entire arsenal when we're fighting some of those really challenging soils we experience.
Yeah.
Cool.
The only thing you said that I don't agree with was you said plants, soil's not sacred, plants are sacred. Isn't that what you said?
I'm talking about these soils, our manufactured soils.
Oh, okay.
Oftentimes I'll hear all the time about how, oh, you got to protect the root ball. And it's this misconception that that soil, oh, that root ball needs to be perfect and round. That's something I see a lot on Facebook, Instagram. Maybe I'm on too much social media. Maybe I'm not working enough. But all these people will be commenting about how important this is. And especially our manufactured soils, we're losing there. We don't care about that with our plant. We care about the root of the plant.
The manufactured soil, obviously, ours is all, native bark, so it's not artificial and it's renewable. But it is, in a way, manufactured, and we have a specific bark mix that is supposed to grow the nicest roots possible. But it only does that for a while, right? There's plenty of stuff where we have to either make the call to toss it or pot it up after, a year or two, because the soil's degraded to the point that the organic matter's just become this wet, viscous mud. And that's why it's not sacred when it gets in the landscape, because it'll do the same thing in the pot or in the hole that you throw the plant into.
You do it in bark? You plant it in bark? I thought bark was keeps water away. And
when it is dry, it is very hydrophobic.
yeah.
If you properly soak it, it actually acts a lot like other soil, like soilless media, and it absorbs and holds a lot of water.
And we are getting into some of the weeds on how barks, mulches, composts are determined. And one of the things we have a challenge here is a lot of common lingo is being used. So there is a difference between, you'll find those large bark chips in bags, and that is like true bark chips off of the bark of a Douglas fir. Those are extremely hydrophobic because they're absolutely impregnated with wax. But what Zach is more talking about is a raw wood. So it's much more highly decomposed.
You probably wouldn't call it bark. It's called like a medium fir or something, and it's literally just like ground up, fresh, slightly decomposed bark.
Yeah.
I have something.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. Well, what about adding microbes and humic acids and axis and all these wonderful things too? I've worked with some amazingly horrible soils. I manage trilogy. Some of the worst soils. I replaced thousands of trees and shrubs, and that's not an understatement. And I've worked with Shea Homes. I've worked with some of these big developers, and they do no prep. And talk about baskets and burlap. I saw it all.
Oh yeah.
And I saw massive disease, and I saw the soil they're putting in was just basically rock and crap. Worked with Andrikas in the last few years, and we're trying to restore the soils, and that's the biggest challenge. And when you put it into most existing soils, even potting soils and that kind of thing, a lot of them just don't have the nutrients to sustain a lot of plants and life. So I've had a lot of great success with putting mycorrhizas and humic acids and even axis. They do a lot in the Southwest. So it gets you past, it's a natural polymer basically in the soil in dry areas, and that's worked great. Taking some of the worst soils you imagine and just a few amendments, been like night to day. And I've been amazed at some of the plants I've grown in some of the worst soils you could imagine. But Mother Nature by itself, there's very few good soils I've seen that contractors leave us, unfortunately. I mean, I've seen 2 feet of the most wonderful soil you've ever seen gone down to glacial till and plants put in the ground. Yeah. No amendments, no food. And of course they get diseased and struggle and die back, and they die. That's pretty much what happens with a lot of our contractors, unfortunately, because they're, and it doesn't cost much to add good things. That's what's an amazing thing per plant. It's so small. They just don't understand how soils work, like you said. And we've been, we got a lot of growers now linking this way. We've been in the canvas world, and I'm seeing the results, but it is adding some of the goodies back. You have a lot of great ideas on how to plant, and it's really good stuff. And I think adding those extra goodies to the soil, even an organic fertilizer that breaks down very slow and consistently over long and starts building, works so much better than synthetics.
Yeah, and there's definitely some different opinions and you know it, in the industry about how these different things work. It is a really challenging thing to test in a laboratory setting, and so that's where I would temper some of my expectations. And then, but there's certainly some things you have there where we know if you have a soil that is devoid of fungus, you need it. Fungus is life. It's a part of those mycorrhizal associations with roots is how they're increasing a large portion of their root mass. And so that's one of the things where there are some misconceptions. Oftentimes we'll see homeowners overdo it. They'll be throwing a half bag of this stuff in there, where a small tablespoonful is hundreds of thousands of units of those things. So some of that is more about inoculating our space, but then also keeping in mind, because it can be hard to get some of these nuanced things repeatable with our crews. We don't want to be creating islands in this sea of soil. We want to be improving all of our soils together. We don't want to be specifically training our plant that where you're at is the best place to be. We want these roots to be expanding in distance because we know a lot of our trees, a lot of our shrubs are going to have roots at least 3 times as long radially as they are tall.
Yeah, if you can redo a large area, that's obviously the ultimate. And Rodriguez goes extremes, what he does. I mean, the feet and miles. But reality is, for a lot of homeowners, they won't pay for that. And I sell at retail level too. So I'm in contact with a lot of homeowners and a growing list of homeowners and different garden centers all over the Northwest and expanding. And I do talks with them. And it's like they can afford to at least give that plant something at the time of planting, or get a contractor to at least do something in that horrible soil. So amending it, adding a humic acid that we sell and growing liquid, amending these kind of things to the soil, even in a small area, is better than nothing. And that's what and it does, it makes a huge difference. And I have people that now will just say, hey, Michael, I want that product, where do I get it? And they've used it. And right, and it is all training. They don't, if I don't train them, they could put a half a cup of mycorrhizae on the plant. No, you put a teaspoon or a tablespoon. And then they get that information, they do just that, and then they buy the humic acids, and they just that, and they mix in what they can afford. I think for a lot of contractors, just doing, and a lot of them don't do anything. You want to, but the reality is most of them don't really do anything. Yeah. And getting them to do something like you're talking about, in the perfect world, you're right, it would be basically doing the whole area, and somebody will pay for that. That's what you should do. But you still got to.
But perfect world is planting back into our native soils. Hopefully, perfect world's us not stripping all the soils away.
Exactly, that's what it should be.
But what you're getting at is, our soil structure is hugely important. And so what we can do to help feed our soils and build our soils up, that's a huge part of plant success. What we see above ground, a lot of those root causes are below ground. So what we can do to help build our soil.
Yeah, and I had people put mycorrhizae on this server. So I say, no, mycorrhizae does not crawl down into your ground. You put it by the root system, or don't put it at all, because you're wasting your money. And it's the reality. And they start doing that. And they'll say, oh my God, I can see the difference. And then they come back. And that's what's great, is that I get all this feedback from all of our customer base, and they'll be like, yeah, every plant they put in the ground, they have mycorrhizae around it. It's like, and they never knew what it was until I educated them on it. But yeah, so I think that's a part of this, our industry. I would like to get some of these guys that think they cannot afford it to do anything, and they can afford to do a little bit. And it is not horribly expensive.
Absolutely.
And it's getting them to think differently. And that's been my biggest challenge. I have some people that just like you'll just do it right, but still there's certain situations where you can amend the whole soil, because they just won't pay for
it. Hey, Phil, your mic's open. We're hearing.
Yeah, I think Phil's
playing with my dog. Sorry.
Yeah, and the mycorrhizae portion of it's important. There's been a lot of research with that, and the whole thing is making sure that the soil is as close to our native soils we can hopefully get it. the mulching helps. It's going to bring some of those mycorrhizae. If you're a nursery that partakes in some of that, we have applied mycorrhizae. We do apply it to native plants. We do it because we get good benefits out of it. And that's kind of the part of the process. I can't speak to what it looks like out in the landscape, but it is part of the process. If you've got a healthy soil, it should already be inoculating your plants, or they'll already have it when they're coming in. But if you're going into a really terrible soil and you've got a really artificial soilless media that your nursery stock's coming from, then yeah, you got to do something because the plants.
Every contractor installer, then what you guys may do right, 80% of what I've seen is bad. The contractor did nothing. They don't even amend it half the time. And I'm looking about $1 million homes sitting on garbage. And I'm just shaking my head. It wouldn't cost, and homeowners do nothing. They just see this house. They don't know anything thinking about the soil. Then they go out to dig a flower in the ground and they go, like, oh my God, what the hell did I buy? And that's pretty much common in the industry, unfortunately. And
we all owe it to our industry and to our clients to educate them on soils and on plants. And yeah, it's hugely disappointing to tell a customer, yeah, this brand new custom multi-million home you bought, they really F these soils up and they gave you straight garbage, but this is the truth and this is the reality you're faced, because otherwise we have to manage those expectations on the backside. You're not going to. Yeah, we're going to see some chlorosis from my planting because I'm planting into parent clay material. I'd much rather have this conversation up front, appropriately apply who's responsible for that, and then temper some of those expectations and let them know, hey, here's that ongoing care. Because like most of us, we all want value. If you're looking for the cheapest clients, that may be your business model. I'll leave it to you. But I'm going to focus on value for my clients. And so teaching them these things, they really appreciate it. Even if they don't hire you, this has happened to me a ton in the Woodinville area. People will not hire me like, oh, you are too expensive, I'm going to go with the cheaper guy. But it's my name who's getting passed around, not the cheaper guy. Even though he won the job and planted it and it looked good day one, I'm the one who's winning all these neighbors because they're like, Brandon took the time to explain why what's going on is what's going on, the problems that I experienced in the past. And I'm probably going to pick that client up in 2 to 3 years when they get a 30 to 50% fatality rate over 3 years, which is, there's just no need for it with a little bit of effort. You remember, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Talking about these masks here, eh?
So how would you fix those people with a multi-million-dollar house and their soil is crap? How do you, besides just good planting practices?
I mean, best case scenario for me, if I get my way, I'm going to be bringing in arborist chips because that's the fastest way I know how to repair a soil and cause the least amount of damage to existing root systems. It's really hard to beat just how quickly a thick layer of arborist chips can help a soil and just the amount of root development, fungi development we'll see. And so that's definitely one of my favorites.
And how do you overcome the people's talking about that doesn't look good?
Yeah, that's where I might lose a little bit. So if it doesn't look good enough for them, like a job I did last year, we went with a compost because that looks finished and it looks clean, which is a funny thing to want your outdoors to look like. So I do a lot of education to my clients about here's what it looks like as it ages. I can show some pictures of that. And also oftentimes I'm able to negotiate with them like, okay, I get it. You want this to look good? Here's a more formal garden near your back door. We'll go with compost. I know it's going to grow weeds really quick. I know it's going to help my soil significantly. I know I'm going to have to replace it a lot more frequently. These are all things that cost my customer more money. But on these large properties, I can then be like, hey, what about some of these back areas? Would you be willing to try some arborist chips? And oftentimes they are because they see, hey, it's less expensive. I'm getting more bang for my buck. And you know what? Yeah, you're right. I'm not spending a whole lot of time in the back 40 of my large yard, or it's so far away from the house. I'm really focused in here, not quite back there. That's something that a designer's eyes oftentimes can be able to help highlight that to a client. We can do that too as landscapers. We can lean on our designers and help explain that to clients. Yeah, that formal garden up near the house, I might be using a different material than some of those far away beds. And honestly, if I can, I'm going to be keeping a lot of my leaves on site. Mulch is mulch is mulch is mulch. And Mother Nature does not create waste. She recycles. And so there's definitely a lot of my clients I'm trying to educate on, hey, it's not highly visible. Let's allow all those leaves to sit there. Let's allow that to be a mulch. You can pay me to haul it away. You can pay me to bring in new mulch. or you can pay me significantly less to return native mulches to their native spaces, while also understanding, yeah, some of these high visibility impact areas, certainly that is where we might want to spend some more money. Because even though we've got a lot of these big multi-million-dollar homes in Washington, in my experience so far, if anyone's got better than me, I'd like to hear. You can educate me on this one. We're always dealing with some of those limited budgets for how much people want to spend on maintenance. Even though it's a multi-million-dollar home, there certainly seems to be a threshold in a lot of these places for not wanting to spend, you know, 5 figures a month, which, okay, I can understand that. There's some good coffee out there to be drinking instead, but that's kind of how I try to.
One of my selling points for arborist chips as mulch is that it does last so long, and I highlight the fact that, you know, you're not going to have to replace this in 2 years. This is going to last you, you know, 3 or 4 years, you know, or if you put it on nice and thick. And I've got a little preferred mulching sheet which lists, you know, a couple options and the pros and cons, and that I send to clients. And you know, another one of the benefits that I highlight of using arborist chips is it does help mask the occasional, you know, the weed here, the leaf there, because it's that non-formal look. It helps to kind of blend and mask all that into the landscape.
Yeah, Will is doing a fantastic job of doing that. Will, would you say you're more or less profitable after you started doing that?
Well, I make my money off of labor, so
hey, mark up your materials a little bit more, man, and then you will.
yeah, right. I know. I need to figure out how to get those arborists dumping their chips at my place, so I don't have to buy them from you know, one of the other resellers.
Yeah, oftentimes for me, because I'm still usually buying my arborist chips, just because then I know I've got that supply. Is mulch is significantly more expensive than arborist chips, so I can have a higher margin on my arborist chips than on my mulch, but the total cost to the client is going to be significantly lower. So I'm getting a higher margin, they're getting a lower final price. I'm delivering a longer lasting product. I'm delivering a product that's conferring significantly more value to their landscape. That's where in my business, that's really a win-win. And so it is something where it's my lower price item, but hey, you guys, just because it's your high price item does not mean it's your high profit margin item. And that's a whole nother talk.
So we are going on now just about an hour since the meeting started. Is there any more questions to do with transplanting?
Thank you.